Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of our team and our friends at the LA Bay Book Company, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Roth in Conversation, part of our Civic series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for joining us here on our new streaming platform, myths.org. Like everything at Town Hall, it is work in progress. So please don't hesitate to tell us about your experience using the address you see at the chat below the video pane. Tonight's conversation will run around 60 minutes, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field below the video. So please submit yours at any time. You can also text your questions to 206-504-2857. That number's below as well. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. And for those who'd like to view the player with closed caption, view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of your video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day, even as we see the light breaking on the horizon and live events on the way. We're still going to continue to do plenty of virtual events. Upcoming programs include Sebastian Junger tomorrow night, reporting worldwide on struggles for autonomy and community. Annette Gordon-Green on the history of Juneteenth. The next edition of our Earshot Jazz concert series, Saturday night series, continuing this weekend with the Marina Albero Trio. She's a wonderful jazz pianist and hammered dulcimer player. Seattle City Club's next civic cocktail event, local journalists discussing the impact of the George Floyd verdict on our region, especially in light of the recent charges in Tacoma. And an appearance by Temple Grandin, co-produced with our terrific partners at the Institute for Systems Biology. You can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civics series is supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, the Norcliffe Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But finally, as most of you know, Town Hall is at heart a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. One last note on that point, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book being discussed, please use the link in the chat below to buy from our partner bookseller at the LA Bay Book Company. Please buy local and help ensure that the wonderful things we recall faintly about this community from before the pandemic will keep thriving on the other side. And with that, Mickey Huff is the director of Project Censored, a post he has held since 2010. Since then, he's also been co-host and executive producer of the Project Censored show on Pacifica Radio. In 2016, he became president of the nonprofit Media Freedom Foundation. In 2019, he co-authored United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America and What We Can Do About It. Huff is a professor of social science and history at Diablo Valley College, where he co-chairs the history program and is chair of the journalism department. He also serves on the editorial board of the journal Secrecy and Society and on the board of the nonprofit Behind the Headlines. Andy Lee Roth is associate director of Project Censored and coordinator of the project's campus affiliates program. His research and writing have appeared in the Index on Censorship, In These Times, Yes Magazine, and the International Journal of Press and Politics, among many other outlets. Roth has taught sociology at Pomona College, Bard College, and other schools, and he serves on the board of the Media Freedom Foundation. The 2021 edition of Project Censored's State of the Free Press is the subject of their discussion this evening. Please join me in welcoming Mickey Huff and Andy Lee Roth.
Thanks so much, Weir. It's an honor to be here, and we'd like to thank everybody. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Weir Harmon. We are honored to be here today. Sorry, I had a mute malfunction. So those are commonplace these days. Sorry about that. It's an honor to be here today, and we want to thank everybody at Town Hall Seattle. We want to thank Candace Wilkinson Davis, Bruno Lacrier, Megan Castillo, and of course the Elliott Bay Book Company. Please do consider supporting your local independent bookstore. And Project Censored has been a long time supporter, of course, of independent booksellers and publishers. As you heard Weir say, I'm Mickey Huff. I'm the director of Project Censored. Andy Lee Roth and I, this past year, we published an annual book at Project Censored. The latest book is Project Censored State of the Free Press 2021. And we're going to be in conversation here for about a half an hour, and then we're going to get to your questions. So we figured a nice way for us to start out would be to just give a little brief background about how we got involved in supporting media freedom and how we got involved in anti-censorship movements and pro-free press movements. And for me, that goes back to my early years growing up in working class Pennsylvania. My parents had a lot of books around the house and a lot of media. And so I grew up, again, at an early age with a lot of information around me, and we really paid attention to the news. And by the time I became a teenager, I got really interested, not just in the news, but I got really interested in the things that maybe we weren't being told. As a musician and somebody that went on to be a professional musician later, my sort of heavy metal and punk rock sensibilities led me in a lot of ways to just question narratives and question what was happening and wonder, what else we weren't being told. And so at an early age, I was against censorship. As a teenager in the 1980s, I was an activist against the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, that was labeling records, right? And I learned an interesting lesson early on in my life in the mid 80s, and that was censorship backfires. A lot of the bands and a lot of the, from Jello Biafra and the Dead Kennedys to Dee Snider and Twisted Sister and all, they kind of wore that record label warning as a badge of honor. And so, I went on to do a lot of work in college against censorship in the arts, looking into the National Endowment of the Arts, these types of things. And in college, again, as my degrees were in history, I was always interested in the unhistory, as it were, right? The stories that we weren't being told and whose voices were being marginalized. Well, obviously that connection between journalism and history and also the arts and expression really kind of stuck with me. And when I moved all the way out to the left coast in San Francisco, Berkeley, San Francisco, I landed in an area that where Project Censored was founded. Right. So I remember before I moved to California in 1993, I stumbled in a Barnes and Noble and I stumbled across the first published version of Project Censored's annual yearbook in 1993. Carl Jensen founded the project back in 1776. We'll get to that in a moment. But when I came out here, I realized that I was only an hour away from the home of Project Censored at Sonoma State and Peter Phillips. So I doggedly pursued him, kind of in punk rock fashion, right? Showing up at gigs, showing up where Peter was, emailing him, kind of just, really trying to get involved. And Peter Phillips is such an incredible mentor and just a fabulous human being, as well as a scholar, a great scholar. Peter really helped me out and brought me on board. And that is where I ended up meeting Andy Lee Roth. Watch what you wish for, right? Because I really wanted to get involved. And the next thing you know, I was involved way up over my head in this stuff. But it's been an honor and it's been a privilege. And so that's sort of the real short story about how I got really interested in media censorship and what we can do to combat it and support a truly free press. So with that, I want to hand things over to Andy. And so Andy can tell his story about how he got involved with the project. Andy?
better? Yeah, so I grew up in Southern California. I was saying, trying to say, Mickey and I have in common not only our work with Project Censored, but this kind of sensibility formed in adolescence by exposure to, punk rock and other kind of alternative music, and that kind of do-it-yourself DIY approach to things, and that questioning of authority that is so enmeshed in the music of that. Of those styles and genres. But my really formative experience was in school. As a graduate student at UCLA, I became interested. I was a graduate student in sociology, so I came with an interest in power and inequalities of power and the distribution of power and how that affects society and people's life chances. But at UCLA, I really became exposed through one of my mentors, Steve Klayman, to the kind of sociology of news production literature, and looking at how social forces shape the production of news stories became a passion of mine and the focus of my dissertation research. So looking at how things like professional news values for journalism and journalists, and how those shape the organization of news outlets and the day-to-day routines of the people who work at those outlets. And that led me to looking at things like theories of gatekeeping and agenda setting, and in general, the idea, as Michael Schudson puts it, of the power of news. I became involved in the project around 2006 when I was a faculty person in the sociology department at Sonoma State University, where Peter Phillips, who Mickey mentioned earlier, was my colleague and at that time the director of the project. And Peter knew that I was interested in news and immediately wanted to get me involved in the project. And I sort of am this personality type of, I want to just get oriented before I take on anything, big and as impressive as working on Project Censored, which I knew about from my graduate studies. And Peter was like, no. We'll get you connected with 3 or 4 student interns and you guys will write a chapter in the next book. And I was like, whoa, okay. And so we wrote that term, that first semester, basically, this group of students and I, who I had just met, reached out to all these people who were involved in kind of alternative media, indie media, and so forth. And just by saying like, well, I'm calling from Project Censored and we'd like to interview you for the next book, doors open and people are saying, oh, I'm really busy, but of course. And I was like, wow, this is kind of amazing. But even more than that, the amazing thing that has not diminished at all in the 15 years or so that I've been involved in the project is my amazement and the hope it gives me to see the ways that students who are involved in the project flourish and really become inspired and informed by the project. And we'll talk more about that as the course of the evening goes on. But long story short, my background as a sociologist, my interest in power, and then realizing that the project provides a vehicle for exploring those things, not in a way that is kind of ivory tower academic, where it's just one sociologist talking to other sociologists, but in a way that's public, where the work that we do is, although it may be of interest to other professional sociologists, it's really guided by the principle that the role of the project is to inform the public about the importance of media freedoms, about the dangers of censorship in all its guises, to ultimately to democracy, to our ability to be a well-engaged population and that can self-govern. Yeah.
So the history, since we're just introducing a little bit of how we got involved with Project Censored, it's a good time to just say, some of you may not know about Project Censored. You can go to projectcensored.org to learn more about us. We were founded in 1976 by Carl Jensen, who is the force that was behind the communications department, founding that at Sonoma State University. And he was the director of the project for 20 years before handing it over to Peter Phillips, who directed the project until 2010. And as Andy just said, he came in during that period, and so did I, and Andy have been working together ever since. But how did the project get started? And the reason that I think that that's relevant to what we're doing here this evening is that it started with a question, and it's a question that's still important, right? It's kind of riffing a little bit on how I got involved in the project, and that's, well, whose stories are told, and by default, of course, which ones aren't, and how can we trust that the media tell us the things that we need to know to be self-governing in an efficacious way? Carl Jensen, coming out of the 1970s, and the project's 1976, he was looking in the rearview mirror at the 1972 election. And of course, by that point, it was already after Watergate. Richard Nixon resigned. And he was saying, this is a very curious situation, because he started to understand that a lot of things were known about Nixon and Watergate and other scandals prior to the story coming out in the Washington Post. So in other words, Carl asked this question about, well, what would have happened if the American public had known more fully what was happening in the Nixon administration before his landslide reelection in 1972? And that was basically the kernel, the core question that he asked, and he put it to his class. And so for 20 years, Carl had people in his classes literally surveying alternative and independent news media, right? Remember, the 1970s, this is before cable, this is before the internet. And so he literally had hard copies of papers and magazines and journals coming in, and the students looked at these and they would pick stories that they thought were really profound and very important, and then they would scour to see where they were covered in the corporate media. And again, people usually use the term mainstream media. We don't use that term because there's nothing very mainstream about 6 corporations that control 90% of our media systems. So we talk about corporate media or establishment or legacy media in that regard, because we do think language matters. But cutting to the chase, Carl then used this question to produce a list every year, and he went out and recruited journalists and academics and scholars that would then vet, and they would vote on these stories about their importance, and other faculty members who were experts in the area would help teach students. Look, this is back before there was even a term critical media literacy, right? Carl Jensen was doing critical media literacy education before we even knew how to talk about it in a lot of ways. And so that's what makes him a pioneering figure in our eyes, particularly. But again, and a lot of people early on that were big supporters of the project included Hugh Downs, who was at 2020, Walter Cronkite, right, America's anchor person, right, back in the day. So Carl had attracted a lot of interesting attention, and that was the birth of Project Censored. So we also have a definition for censorship. We believe censorship isn't just the traditional definitions of a governing power structure that comes down from on high and blacks out stories. Does that happen? Yes, we know that happens. And we know that because of whistleblowers. And we know that because of people like Julian Assange. And we know that because of people like Edward Snowden. Well, Carl Jensen knew it because of people like Daniel Ellsberg, right? And the Pentagon Papers. So censorship for us is anything that interferes with the free flow of information in a society that purports to have a free press system, right? So we have a pretty broad definition of censorship, and we think it's important to look at the many nuanced ways that information can be controlled, winnowed, curated, framed, spun, etc., up to and including outright censorship. So just again, from the beginning, we just figured we wanted to give you a few sort of little background information about who we are as an organization and what we do. And just as Andy said, we are a critical media literacy education organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and Andy's going to talk a little bit here about the program that he helps do, the Validated Independent News and Campus Affiliates program that we work with people all over the country. But we also break down our media analysis into multiple categories. So we look at the news that doesn't make the news and analyze why. We look at a deja vu history, sort of what has happened to previous censored stories and whether or not there are updates on those, or when do the corporate media get around to covering those stories? Well, sometimes they do. Other times stories will languish in obscurity for a long time. But sometimes it takes a year or two, but the corporate media do end up covering some of these important stories. And we think it's important to note that. We also cover what Carl Jensen called junk food news, Twinkies for the brain, right? Whether or not you care, you know that Kim Ye is getting a divorce. And you might know about Gorilla Girl and TikTok and these kind of things, right? We also do Media Democracy in Action, which is an analysis of solutions groups and people that are really making a difference in First Amendment issues. So we don't just look at what's wrong with a lot of corporate media. We also look at what grassroots groups are doing in our estimation, what we think is right in a lot of ways. And we also do a weekly public affairs show, Project Censored show, documentary films. And of course, we do this annual book with 7 Stories Press out of New York. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we do at Project Censored. And we want to, again, reiterate that students and education in the public interest is really what we're all about. And I know Andy wants to now talk about sort of what are more of our guiding principles at Project Censored. And Andy can talk a little bit more about our validated independent news program and affiliates. Andy?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I mean, so guiding principles, some of these may already be evident from what we've said so far, but we actually enumerate them, elaborate them in the, whoa, that's breaking up in interesting ways, in the introduction to this year's yearbook. The project champions independent investigative journalism. Independent, that is, as a distinction from the corporate news media that Mickey mentioned earlier, the kind of monopoly version of what the news consists of. That's the affirmative side of the project. We champion independent investigative journalism, and this is, in fact, I think, a kind of a golden era for independent journalism in the United States, in the history of the United States. On the critical side, we hold the corporate media to account when they fail to provide the public the kind of information we need to be engaged community members and active, informed citizens. Those two things come together in the top 25 list. That's kind of one of the cornerstones of each year's yearbook, and I'll say more about those in a moment. But behind the scenes, the project, another of our guiding principles is that we provide hands-on training in critical media literacy to undergraduate students through this campus affiliates program that Mickey mentioned earlier that unites several dozen college and university campuses across the United States and some years across North America. And we make those students' work public. This is a very important thing. The students are the ones, all the stories that we'll talk about in a few moments, or point to at least in a few moments, are stories that were initially broken by independent investigative journalists, but have been vetted, reviewed, and summarized by undergraduate students who participate in this campus affiliates program that the project sponsors. So, and we make those students' work public through the project's website and through the annual book. And that's very important. As a classroom teacher myself, I think it's absolutely critical not only to provide hands-on training in critical media literacy, but Nikki, you know this too, that the students really respond when they learn that the work they're doing isn't just another assignment that will be only read by the professor, but will actually also have a wider audience beyond the 4 walls of the classroom. So that's a third element that guides the project in its work. The fourth element is that we at the project believe that increasing the public's awareness of, its trust for, and its trust in, and its support for independent journalism is one crucial dimension of every social movement, right? Every movement for social justice. Without kind of a robust independent media, the causes that different social justice movements are pursuing are unlikely to get a kind of a fair hearing in the public sphere. And I'll talk more in a little later this evening about this idea of the freedom of the press and freedom of speech is not just the right to say something or to say what's on your mind, but also the right to hear and to know diverse opinions. And part of the critique of the corporate news media that Project Censored advances, and I believe we document empirically through our work, is that by and large, the corporate news media provide us with a fairly narrow definition of what counts as news and who counts as newsworthy. So one way we talk about this in this year's book, Mickey and I were talking one day and we were riffing on, you know, the standard kind of model now is the idea of a 24/7 news cycle. The idea that with the advent first of cable news as an expansion of network television news programming, and then really multiplied with the advent of the internet, the idea that you can log in at any time of the day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and find new news, which sounds great, but as Carl Jensen talked about when he was director, this creates the problem of news inflation. The idea that we have more and more of it, but it seems to be worth less and less. And I think the last handful of years with concern over fake news and bias of one political angle or another has really underscored the insights of that notion of news inflation. What's it worth? So, we talk in the introduction to this year's book about the kind of the squalls of the 24/7 news cycle. The idea that there's news content that is driven not by ethical principles of journalism, but rather by the need for ratings, the need for audience, right? So you get clickbait-driven coverage, you get pundits with their hot takes, you get social media feeds where the news you see is governed by secretive proprietary algorithms. The project takes a step back from all that. We are not a 24/7 news organization, though we have, as Mickey's mentioned, a weekly radio program. We don't try to play that game, and we believe that there are real advantages to what we call a 52/12 news cycle, where we take a long-term view, 52 weeks in the year, 12 months in the year. And so we put out a book every year that, by taking that longer news cycle, allows us to look at systemic patterns and what you could think of as subsurface trends in news coverage, right? This means that we see clearly how independent news reporters are consistently bringing forward stories of systemic inequality that are missed in the 24/7 news cycle that most corporate news outlets are driven by, and basically prisoners too. So one way you could summarize this idea, besides the 52/12 versus 24/7, is the 24/7 news cycle tends to focus people's attention on what went wrong today. Our 52/12 cycle allows us to talk more seriously and to point out journalism that calls attention to what goes wrong every day, right? And so some of the stories that are featured in this year's top 25 list exemplify that perspective. I should emphasize at the outset that each of these stories that Mickey and I will talk about in the next couple of minutes, two things about them. One is each of them are on this year's top 25 story list because they have been woefully neglected by the corporate news media. They've either been left out of the discussion altogether, or they've been reported in partial ways, in both sense of that term, partial meaning both incomplete, but also perhaps in biased or slanted ways. The other thing about these top 25 stories is if there are any of them that we begin to glance at that you want to know more about, they're all posted in detail on the Project Censored website, and you can dig into them there in addition to in the hard copy of the book. So a few of the stories that we've covered this year. One of our top stories is a story broken by The Guardian, the independent UK newspaper, about how Monsanto, the agricultural giant now owned by Bayer, established an advanced so-called intelligence fusion center to surveil and discredit its critics, including journalists like Carrie Gillum, a Reuters journalist that people at the Monsanto Intelligence Fusion Center attempted to have fired from her job at Reuters because she was reporting on links between Monsanto's Roundup, the most widely used herbicide in the world, and links between that product of Monsanto and cancer. Another of our top stories for this year is how the US military is a massive hidden contributor to climate crisis. A report that appeared first in an independent news outlet called The Conversation, where the report focuses on how the US military, were it a country, would be one of the 40-something largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world. That's based on the data that the authors were able to dig through Freedom of Information requests, that to operate a single US Marine Corps forward operating base requires some 5,000 gallons of fuel per day, and all that fuel has to be transported to the site. So the US military emissions are a major cause of climate change, even though those emissions are often overlooked in studies of climate change. And then the one that I wanted to dig in a little deeper to is actually our #1 story for the year, as voted for by the judges who Mickey mentioned earlier. And that's the story of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls who face violence, including murder, kidnapping, sex trafficking, and rape, with such a shocking regularity that violence can be considered an epidemic, according to a report by Danielle McLean in 2019 from Think Progress. Backing up McLean's claims are data from the Urban Indian Health Institute, a Seattle-based organization, that found that in 2016, more than 5,700 missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls they could find records of that many, but only 116 of those were logged as missing or murdered in the Department of Justice's federal database. At the same time, nonetheless, the Department of Justice acknowledged that on some tribal lands, Indigenous women were murdered at a rate of 10 times the national average. This isn't simply, though, our #1 story because it's a story of unreported victimhood. It's also an important but underreported story because of the activism in response to this epidemic of violence. The Sovereign Bodies Institute, the Braveheart Society, Urban Indian Health Institute, as I mentioned a moment ago, have all been proactive organizations identifying the root causes of this epidemic of violence, which involve not only systemic racism and the enduring legacy of settler colonialism, but also issues with law enforcement and flawed policy and the lack of reliable, comprehensive data. This is a story as stunning as it is, and I'm giving you just some of the details tonight. You can read more, as I say, in the book and also on the Project Censored website. This is a story we would know next to nothing about if we relied exclusively on corporate news media. What we know about this story, as incredible as it is the result of independent investigative journalism. Outlets like I've mentioned, Think Progress, The Guardian, a shout out to Yes Magazine based there in Seattle, Bainbridge Island area, and Ms. Magazine. I also want to give a shout out, as we do in the book, to the Seattle Times, which ran and continues to run an impressive docuseries on this topic called Not Invisible, that if you haven't seen it, you should definitely check out. So our #1 story from this year, the result of an entire year worth of student research and vetting, and the voting process that our judges, our panel of 28 expert judges undertake, that left us, I'm proud to say, with, I think, an incredibly important #1 story, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Mickey, you were going to talk some, I think, about another of the stories on the top 10 list involving the importance of funding journalism adequately, which seems like an appropriate response to this, the story I've just described.
Yeah, actually, I was going to talk a little bit. Thank you, Andy. I was going to talk quickly about a couple stories because eventually we want to, wrap up some of what we're doing and have Q&A with folks. But the story that Andy just talked about, the #1 story about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that is a story that most folks hadn't heard of. And so corporate media has recently sort of gotten a little more hip to that story because of the appointment of Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior with Native American background. So that kind of thing is, really platformed it in a way and given more attention to it. So, when we come back and do the deja vu thing, that's what we do every year. Like we go back and look at what happens to previous stories. This is another great example of that. Just in the last year, that story went from obscurity to something that actually is getting some of the attention that it deserves. It certainly should be even more so.
I think, Nikki, I would just interject there and say the intention that it has been giving has been tended to focus on what Congress and elected officials are doing, and is tended to sideshow the important work of groups like the Sovereign Bodies Institute, the Braveheart Society, the Urban Indian Health Institute, who have actually been pioneering a lot of the research and the policy work. So yes, I agreed completely. Like there is coverage now, but that coverage, and this goes to a point I think we'll come back around to, right? Not all coverage is equal.
No. So what kind of coverage, right?
Exactly.
And
yes.
This gets to the point of our definition of censorship, right? And that's why that we have a definition that's broad, because it's not just that you never heard of it. It's now, how is it being covered? How's it being spun? And what are people tending to pay attention to instead of what's at the core of the story? So excellent point, Andy.
I think, the same thing, just going back and picking up a little bit more on the Monsanto story is another case in point. And Mickey, we should probably go a little freeform here because I think we need to
sure.
transition. But on the Monsanto story, we did find that ABC News had covered that story. But when we looked closely, when the student who researched that story looked closely at the ABC News coverage, what they found was ABC News will cover Monsanto's Intelligence Fusion Center, but guess who the sources for the ABC News report are, right? They're all spokespeople for Monsanto Bayer, or the alternative sources in that article are people who work for the PR company that represents Monsanto and Bayer, right?
Yeah.
So the range of opinion in that story couldn't be much narrower. There is no counterpoint to whatever the official line is from Monsanto Bayer and its PR hacks. Whereas when you read the independent news coverage of it, you get people like our buddy Dave Moss at Electronic Frontier Foundation saying it's perfectly normal and reasonable for companies to keep an eye on how they're being talked about in the news. But the Monsanto Intelligence Fusion Center goes way beyond anything that any normal corporation has or should have, right? That it's surveilling people at a level that, not that it's acceptable for national governments to surveil in this way, but that the Monsanto operations were comparable to the kind of thing that the national security the NSA is doing. So yeah, maybe this is kind of discouraging. Mickey, maybe we should talk some about in 5 or 6 minutes before we transition to Q&A. Maybe we should talk some about kind of why the free press matters and what to do about some of the problems that we've been raising.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a few other stories we were going to get at, but in the interest of time, we want to sort of move over that conversation. Just quickly, a couple of the stories we were going to mention was the case of Abby Martin and the boycott, divestment, sanctions issue when she was censored from a critical media literacy conference. And there was just a recent lawsuit that was decided in her favor, right, against censorship and against loyalty oaths in the U.S. to the state of Israel. That's very timely right now because of what's been happening in Gaza and in the West Bank in the last couple of weeks. Another story, just very quickly, about why the media matters, and speaking to that more directly, one of the stories in the book was reviving journalism with a stimulus package for a public option. The CARES Act, which was just, $2 trillion, right? There was no real money in that to have a robust free press. And people like Craig Aaron at Free Press and scholars like Victor Picard have argued that, well, if we're going to have bailouts for the banks and you're going to have these kind of bailouts for other groups and you're going to have stimulus for this and that, where's the stimulus for the news media and in the public interest? And it's interesting that Picard actually puts a price tag on this at $30 billion, but that's 1.4% of CARES expenditures, that we could create a vibrant, robust public media, right? That, doesn't just do Downton Abbey, but actually does hardcore journalism in the public interest. So, this is what we mean by solutions, right? And we do have the means by which to do this. And if this last year showed us anything, it shows us that the government apparently can come up with money to pay for different things to do this stuff. And we think that we need a serious model that moves away from the corporate model, the advertising, the for-profit model, and really does have a public interest, right? And then we have the kind of stories that we highlight every year, and we have the kind of stories that Andy was just telling you about. So why does media freedom, matter? There's some questions already going on here, right? There's some questions I see. So there's some questions coming in that we're going to address in a moment. But media freedom really matters, and free press really matters, because if you take a look at what the corporate media do, Matt Taibbi writes about this in the foreword to our book this year, the journalist who was at Rolling Stone. He talks about how there's this hyper-partisan media and back and forth. And rather than hear the hard-hitting news that you could be hearing, like the stories that Andy just said, those aren't really attractive to the corporate media, right? What they want to do is they treat topics like wrestling matches. They treat the two parties as if they're just like hyper-partisanship it rules the day. Fox News versus MSNBC. It's Rachel versus Tucker. And who loses in that is us, is we the people, right? And Taibbi points that out really well in the introduction. It really is important for us to note what corporate media do and how much of what they do we don't really need, right? And given that more and more people are getting news and information from things like social media platforms, which is very problematic, we need to start paying more attention, not just to who the advertisers are and the owners of media, but as Andy Roth writes in a new article at the Marquez Review, who are the new gatekeepers? Who are the curators? How do algorithms prevent us from seeing things? How does social media work to tell us only the things it thinks that we want to know rather than the things that we need to know? So Project Censored, I think, really continues to be relevant in that regard by looking at these, really key issues. And there's actually already a couple of great questions here going on in the Q&A, but I wanted to send it back to Andy momentarily about these issues of censorship and media freedom. And, why should we be worried about the things that we don't see? Right? It's not just human beings now that are preventing us from seeing stories. It's algorithms, right? And I know, Andy, you did a really fabulous study with Abram Anderson on YouTube's algorithms blacking out LGBTQ stories and so on. So maybe for a couple minutes here, just before we dive into Q&A, you want to talk a little bit about the work you've done on that front.
Yeah, I think one of the things is that to be literate in a critical sense now, media sense, you have to be algorithmically literate. The role of artificial intelligence in shaping the kind of news stories we're likely to see, especially if we're on social media, on Facebook or whatever, Twitter, is driven more and more by search engines that are not neutral information sources. This was a study that Abram Anderson and I published in the Index on Censorship. We looked closely at the coverage of LGBTQ issues on the Google News aggregator. And what we found was that that coverage was incredibly biased in favor of homophobic and transphobic content from platforms that would be hard to even characterize them as journalistic platforms. So I think, one of the things is to be aware that the search engine you use is not a neutral information source. This is one aspect of what Shoshana Zuboff in Surveillance Capitalism refers to as epistemic inequality, the difference between what we can know and what's known about us. And, as simple as it is, I think not using Google as a verb is a start, right? It's crazy that we have been acculturated to use the name of a company that has done as much to fuel epistemic inequality as anyone or anything, that we use it as a verb for what is basically an everyday practice online. But they're more important, that's a small thing. I think, be aware of how search engines are filtering the news we receive. You can do that by checking out places like Algorithm Watch. People tuning in tonight may know about the work of Joy Buolamwini and her Algorithmic Justice League, which incidentally were just effectively erased by 60 Minutes when they did a story on AI, a racial bias in artificial intelligence involving facial recognition, an area that has been pioneered, the research has been pioneered by Black women. But 60 Minutes, instead of featuring any of those pioneering researchers, put a white journalist who, by his own account, his work was inspired by and built on those women's work. 60 Minutes featured him. So again, the kind of corporate narrow definition of who's newsworthy, who's authoritative. But I think, Mickey, the clock will not slow down for us.
Yeah.
Let's have some questions, hey?
So yeah, so I want to get to the Q&A, and Candace has kindly been shuffling them through, and there's some great ones, so I'll take them topically here. One of them is, do you think the internet has helped or hurt the state of information that is available to citizens today? Well, both. There's clearly great things about what has gone on with the internet and information availability, but at the same time, as technology changes and our tools change, we need to learn how to use the tools and not be used by them, right? And that's why critical media literacy, we think, is the antidote to mis and disinformation, not censorship, not blacklisting, right? Not top-down control of those kinds of narratives or access. And even fact checkers are very problematic. You know, Snopes is a private group, for example. PolitiFact is imperfect. Who checks the checkers, right? And so what we
write about that in the introduction to the book too.
Absolutely. And so as far as that question goes, you know, we think, again, both, it's been a boon and it's also been, well, a bust. It's a new challenge, right? And we have to rise to meet those challenges. And the only way to do that is to try to keep up with that and look at what's behind the screen, so to speak. And Andy talked a little bit about algorithmic literacy. And I think that that's really important thing to notice. It's not that the media is bad. Social media itself isn't bad. And we're not in the practice of shaming people, right, because they're on TikTok or Facebook or what have you. We just simply like to try to tell people to be aware of what's going on with those systems, how algorithms work, and you know, so that you're more in your own driver's seat, so to speak. We're not in the line of business of telling people what to think. We try to help people think more critically and independently. So Andy, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think just as you said, you know, the internet is double-edged in just the ways you're describing. A lot, you know, the project couldn't work the way it works now without the internet. When I was first getting involved in the project, you know, Peter Phillips would show up in class and he literally would toss around to the students in his investigative journalism class, print copies of all these different independent news outlets. There were enough to go around, but there weren't nearly as many as there are now. And so I think, you know, I mentioned at the outset of this program that I think we're living in a golden age of independent news media. And I think the internet is in part a source of that golden age. At the same time as the internet creates all the inequalities we have in life outside of, you know, quote, offline are reproduced online. And so, you know, the sociologist in me says, look, the issues of power and its distribution are as lively and perhaps even multiplied online.
So there's a couple other questions that I'm going to combine because they're pretty related to these issues. Where does Project Censored stand on the canceling or protest of some high-profile book deals, like Josh Hawley or former communications director of the White House, Sean Spicer? I'm sorry. Project Censored is against censorship. We're against cancel culture. I just did an interview with Dan Kovalik not long ago. His new book on Skyhorse is The Case Against Cancel Culture, a progressive case. I'm sorry, it's called Cancel This Book, ripping on Abby Hoffman, the progressive case against cancel culture. So Project Censored, we don't believe in cancel culture. We don't think it's a good idea, and we don't really believe in censorship, which leads to this other question. Someone asked about the 1619 Project, right? And of course, those people paying attention to that may also know that Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is behind that project, was just denied tenure. And it looks as though it's a pretty ideological thing. It's a political thing in that regard. There are states now passing laws against teaching critical race theory. Look, that's problematic all day long. We should also be talking about criticism of critical race theory. We think that we should have robust, open debates. We should be able to agree to disagree. And we should not be in the process of deciding who gets heard and not, right? So we do believe that this, we have been following. The question says, like, have you been following this? Yeah, absolutely. And I'm writing another book now on critical thinking with our colleague and friend Nolan Higdon that makes these arguments. And at the project, we think that all of these kinds of stories, if they're factually accurate and if they are, really significant stories as far as the bulk of the population and society are concerned, we have a responsibility to deal with them. We have a responsibility to address those issues. So Andy, is there anything you want to say about maybe the coverage of the 1619 Project, or just the issue of cancel culture in general that we've seen so much of in the last year?
I mean, I think on the cancellation of those book contracts, that is problematic from a censorship perspective, from a freedom of expression and freedom of speech perspective. Much as I would find some of those books loathsome and I would have very little interest in reading them myself, I don't believe that they ought to be, blockaded that way. But if we're taking a critical media literacy perspective on the publication of books by these, whether they're political pundits or elected officials who when you look at the New York Times bestseller list, a lot of these books by conservative authors appear in the top 10 sales lists. And if you have a critical media literacy perspective, what in sociology we would call a political economy perspective, you would be researching how is it that those books are ending up on the top 10 bestseller lists, right? And partly how they are is through traditional book sales, be it at bookstores or online, but that there are also politicians, the authors or foundations that support the authors gaming the system by buying mass quantities of the books in order to propel them into these prominent places on the bestseller lists. And so that's a way in which there's a thumb on the scale in terms of a public sense of how popular or how significant a book is. And that bears, digging beneath the surface, as is one of our themes tonight.
So one of the earlier questions was about Roman Protasevich in Belarus. It says, do you have any insight or have you been following the story of the flight that was diverted to arrest him and his girlfriend? I've seen headlines, but I'm not completely clear on what happened or why it was so outrageous. Well, at least from the beginning, I could say that this is something that we've seen in terms of people stopping the motion. Remember Edward Snowden, right? How did he get in Russia? Well, it's not because he was working with Putin. It's because then Secretary of State John Kerry revoked his passport, right? And you'll also remember that was it Bolivia or Ecuador, Andy, that we were there, the US was forcibly landing the plane because they believed, I think it was Bolivia, they believed that in fact Snowden was aboard. This is kind of one of those cases getting into Russian politics and the Russian opposition against Putin, that it looks like that there's some international politics playing out here. Frankly, I think it's problematic that, number one, this is a shoot the messenger problem. Number two, you're grounding a passenger jet to basically criminalize somebody in an international flight, right? So this has problems all over it, right? There's a lot of great groups, by the way, that monitor this stuff, and we watch them all the time, whether it's Committee to Protect Journalists, or especially this past year has been a lot of violence against journalists, extraordinary violence. U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, right, does a great job of covering how many acts of violence are committed against journalists. And it's really important that we speak out against acts of violence against journalists. It's not about what they're saying or not, or whether we like them or not. And journalism as an institution and its role in society is important enough that it needs to be protected and not in a partisan way. Andy, do you want to talk about any of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think on that latter, it is important. I mean, I think the situation in Belarus bears very careful tracking, and people who are interested in stories like that, I would point them to places like Index on Censorship that really focus in a global way on these issues. But I think it's also important not to fall into a kind of pitfall of American exceptionalism and think that like, oh, well, it's only journalists in other countries or journalists overseas who are made vulnerable in these ways. Mickey, you mentioned US Press Freedom Tracker, which of course does this remarkable job of verifying every instance it can where in the United States reporters have been subject to attacks, whether they've been subject to arrest or detainments, whether they've had their equipment damaged, or other incidents that would basically keep them from doing their job, either by physically restraining them or intimidating them. In 2020, US Press Freedom Tracker documented some 395 assaults on journalists more than 100 cases of equipment damage, and over 130 arrests or detainments by law enforcement. That last figure was something like a 1,200% increase from the year before, largely attributed to journalists, largely occurring when journalists were covering Black Lives Matter protests across the United States after the police killing of George Floyd. But towards the end of 2020, those figures were also, so it was law enforcement engaged in assaults and damaging journalists' equipment and arresting or detaining journalists. But towards the end of the year, as this kind of Stop the Steal movement began, US Press Freedom Tracker began tracking incidences of citizens attacking journalists. And we know from subsequent reporting about the January 6th assault on the Capitol that, as the Committee to Protect Journalists has documented, like written on one of the doors to the Capitol building was like, murder the press, right? So these threats that we tend to think of as, oh, well, that's just the shady dealings of, a country with a dictator like Belarus or something. We no longer can enjoy such illusions that we're different, we're exceptional. The threats to journalists in the United States, especially journalists covering public protests, are as serious as they've ever been.
So trying to get through the last couple questions here as we're running out of time. Just want to be mindful of all the folks that are here and thank everybody for coming here and joining us this evening at Town Hall Seattle. What's your perspective on Instagram activism and young people getting their information from sources like Instagram, infographics, and TikTok? I just wrote about this with a bunch of students and faculty in our junk food news chapter for next year's book, looking at TikTok and Instagram and so on. And look, again, like we said before, all of these tools can be used for better or worse. We need to learn how these things work. We need to understand meme culture. We need to look at where people are getting their information. One of the challenges of these media are that they're superficial or surface oriented in their presentation, but we hope that they're invitations into something deeper, more significant, right? More long form or investigative. We also think that activism shouldn't just be something that's online. It really does need to be in the streets. It does need to be in public, and we do need to see each other. We don't just need Facebook and FaceTime. We need real time to be with each other and to be in front of each other, which has been very difficult in the pandemic. And here we are on Zoom, right? Which has its own problems of censorship and censoring things in academia and elsewhere. But Andy, do you want to comment on sort of this so-called Instagram activism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I would point people to is the work of Alicia Garza, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, author of the book, The Purpose of Power, who had a fantastic article in the March 2020 issue of In These Times on exactly this topic, talking about how social media profiles and social media platforms can be helpful tools for movements to use, but when they turn into pedestals, they're rarely, if ever, in service of helping a movement achieve its social justice aims. And I think that's quite right. And we have to, I think, cast a wary eye on, again, these platforms are corporate owned, corporate designed, corporate controlled. And so, yes, they can be used in ways that are meaningful, but if they're turning into what Garza calls pedestals, it's a diversion, it's a distraction. So, I think at some point there has to be a conversion from what's happening online to what's actually happening, like in the kind of strangely framed term offline, like in the world.
So I want to thank Candace again for feeding these questions in, and I'm going to try to get as many of them as we can. I know we are at officially 8:30, but I've been given the green light that we can go over a little bit here to address a few more of these concerns. And again, I do apologize for the brevity of some of the responses, but we're trying to cover a lot with a little, and that's kind of the mantra at Project Censored in general, covering a lot with a little. One of the questions is about us surveying foreign press, or non-English media for non-English media stories. And are there other organizations that do this? We do partner with other groups, not just in Canada, which is also English speaking, but in Germany is one. Andy, do you want to mention anything in that regard about other organizations or other people doing this in non-English speaking?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, a kind of what I would think of as one of our allies, the Index on Censorship really has a global reach in the way that the project, I would be among the first to acknowledge, does not. So I would point people there.
Another question is, does the marketplace determine the truth? We could talk about that for another hour, but I'm going to come right out on that one and say no. We don't believe in a post-truth world. We believe in empirical evidence and facts and transparent sources. And it's an ad populum fallacy to suggest that because a majority of people believe something's true, makes it true. That doesn't make it so. And at the project, we're pretty mindful about those kind of stories, and that's how we teach fact checking and vetting of sources. Andy, one other question here. It's maybe getting into the weeds of university press versus independent press sources. How should incidents of bias in university press be addressed? The example was given as microaggressions toward Black students, but I mean, again, what would you say about a university press versus independent press in terms of journalism in that regard?
Well, I mean, hopefully it's still the case that that academic institutions are protected by academic freedoms, and so yes. But I mean, if we're talking about student, campus newspapers and student newspapers, the history of those in terms of legal decisions, including the Supreme Court, is a mixed one, and that's an area, I think, of irritation or concern for folks like us at Project Censored, where somehow, because the people engaged in the work of journalism are students, and therefore perhaps minors, that they somehow have secondary rights or secondary access to those rights. That's a problematic area, I think. Yeah.
And at my own college, where I teach and chair journalism, in the last couple of years, there have been numerous incidents around this. So it's definitely a controversial area, and it's something that, as Andy suggested, we probably need, I think, more safeguards, right? And we need to be more mindful of how student rights are protected in this way. One last one, and probably a good one to end on, because it really gets to, what we do at Project Censored. And it reminds me of an old FCC chairman from back in the 60s and 70s, our good friend Nicholas Johnson, who was a Project Censored judge from going way back to 1976. And Nick Johnson once said that he wrote a book called Your Second Priority. And he said that if, regardless of whatever your first area of interest is, and this is going to get to this question here in a second, regardless what your first area of interest is, if your area of interest is the Middle East politics, if your area of interest is, as Andy was saying earlier, environmental activism, these kinds of things, if your area of interest is Israel-Palestine, if it's election fraud, your second interest had better be media freedom, media democracy, and the support of a free press. Because regardless of the first, if your second isn't in favor of a truly open free press, you're likely to gain very little ground in your first area of interest, right? And so this question is, has Project Censored faced backlash from students or colleagues that have a pro-censorship stance regarding certain issues? And oh, yes, we have. People sometimes get to know us because of a story we'll post or an analysis we'll post about a topic, and then they will mistake us for an advocate of what that topic is about, instead of our advocacy for free press principles around the subject, right? So we may think that there are important unanswered questions around 9/11 or election fraud, or important to talk about Palestinian perspectives and what's happening in the Middle East, but that shouldn't automatically mean that we're taking some sides. And back to Matt Taibbi about both sides, right? There's often more than both sides. There's many sides. And what we think at Project Censored is we've had two judges in 45 years that stepped away from the project because they didn't like some of the stories we were covering, but that's it. Most of the folks that we work with and come around to us, even though, and look, Andy and I don't always agree about what's in the book and what the top stories are with our judges, right? But we honor that process. And we do honor the idea that you can agree to disagree when you're looking at the more important principles. And the more important principles really come back to the Society of Professional Journalists and the guiding principles that we have at the project, right? And just very quickly to sort of address that, and then I want Andy to sort of clean up here for us. The major principles of the Society for Professional Journalists are minimize harm, act independently, be accountable and transparent, right? And the last is seek truth and report it. And what we do at Project Censored is we try to seek truth and report it, and we try to teach others how to figure that out and not get bogged down in the minutia of potentially taking a position, and look at the value of being an informed participatory citizen in a self-governing society. So with that, Andy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, huge issues here. But I would just invoke kind of the project's slogan, which is the news that didn't make the news, right? And so partly what we're in the business is trying to get people to see how media frames for us an understanding of the world. And that frame, like sometimes it's important to look at that frame in order to be able to understand what's being left out of the frame, right? And so one of the things that I do with students, that you don't have to have a lot of resources, access to a big university library or anything, is to just, for any story you're looking at, look at who the quoted sources for that story are, and ask, to what extent do they represent a diverse range of perspectives and informed understanding on that issue. If you want to add one wrinkle to that, do that exercise for both an independent news article on that topic and a corporate news article on that topic. Kind of like what I was talking about with the analysis of the Monsanto Intelligence Fusion Center earlier. You can do that yourself without a lot of resources or training. And when you do that, you'll be doing what the students who are involved in the project do, kind of firsthand, direct, immediate engagement in critical media analysis. And I think anyone can do that. The corporate media aren't interested in advising you about how to do that or having you do that, because I think as soon as more people understand how to do that, the grip of the kind of media monopoly that the corporate news has on our sense of the frame of the world, that frame will start to shake and ultimately disintegrate. And when it does, independent journalists and independent news outlets, like the kinds that we highlight and celebrate in each year's book, will still be there doing what they do, right? Reporting, seeking the truth and reporting it, as Mickey said. Yeah, so thanks everyone for tuning in tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much. That's Andy Lee Roth, my good friend and colleague, Associate Director of Project Censored. I'm Mickey Huff. It's been an honor to be here with you all at Town Hall Seattle. We hope maybe later in the year, early next year, we could possibly come back for our next book in person. That would be great. We want to thank Candace and everybody behind the scenes here at Town Hall Seattle. Thanks to all of you and for all of your questions and comments. To learn more, go to projectcensored.org. You can see our top stories all the way back to 1976. Op-eds, media analysis, our documentary films. We had a new one last year, edited and narrated by Abby Martin of The Empire Files, United States of Distraction, Fighting the Fake News Invasion. We have the weekly radio show archives there going back over 10 years. So again, and also if you want to get in touch with myself or Andy, go to projectcensored.org and get in touch. Maybe you have story ideas, you have some things you'd like to talk to us about, maybe keep the conversation going. So thanks again for all of you for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to the folks at Town Hall Seattle. Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, well, on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank you both so much for presenting tonight. This is such an important topic, something that affects all of us. And thanks for your nuance and insight. And thank you for being so generous with taking all the questions. There were quite a few of them. So I want to thank the audience as well. Thanks for joining us and thank you for your questions. I want to encourage you to purchase a copy of Project Censored, State of the Free Press 2021 from Elliott Bay. The link is right in the chat. There's a bunch of other links there as well, so check those out. But buy from Elliott Bay tonight if you can, and support a local store. And yeah, if we can do it live and if we can do it in person, that would be amazing. But until then, I hope you both stay safe and have a great night.
Thanks so much, Candace.
You too. Thanks so much. It was an honor to be here.